available to you the of these sessions. With that, those are the house rules out of the way. I would like to then take this opportunity to welcome everyone to our final Game Changer series for 2021, which is going to be looking at sustainable supply chain management practices in Africa post-COVID-19. This particular presentation is a result of research that was conducted with the great acknowledgement and support of SIPS, working with AISCA, which is the African Institute of Supply Chain Research, and they implemented a research project that looked at supply chain management practices across Africa post the COVID-19 pandemic. To take us through the session today, we are very fortunate to have two very esteemed researchers and academics in the space of supply chain management. The first one is Professor Ambe, who is a professor in supply chain management, as well as the president of AISCA. And he is, I would confidently say, one of the leading academics within supply chain management within Africa. He's authored several books, as well as journals. He lectures in the space, consults in the space, and provides invaluable thought leadership in the space of supply chain management, also focusing on the practice within Africa. He's also involved in the establishment of a supply chain management council within South Africa and influences that across the continent. He's also joined on this particular presentation by Mr. Ozias Ncube, who is a senior lecturer on supply chain management with the School of Business Leadership at UNISA. Mr. Ncube, I will say that those within the space of supply chain management who don't know him, then I begin to question whether they are in supply chain management, because he himself has authored various journals within the space. He lectures in the space. He's very involved in terms of the profession and providing a thought leadership and guidance within the supply chain space, also for very many years. I will not say the number of years because then I will begin to date him in terms of age. And I will also be joining the presentation as I also participated in the research, sharing in the particular presentation. Coming through from AISCA, I was representing AISCA in the presentation, and I'm also with SIPS as a fellow at SIPS. So this afternoon, you will really be engaged by industry and academics in the space who are going to be sharing the research that they conducted within looking at sustainable supply chain management practices in Africa post-COVID-19. With that introduction, I'm going to hand over to Professor Ambe, who will then begin the Game Changer series. Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nteta. Good afternoon or good day, whatever it is, our esteemed attendees. It is indeed a pleasure to be here with you. And it's also worth it to note that this is the last supply chain management Game Changer series for the year. And we want to thank you for the leadership role that you have played and you continue to play in shaping supply chain management. Colleagues, today we would be talking about sustainable supply chain management practices in Africa post-COVID-19. If you can see, we have esteemed colleagues that were involved in this project. And of course, it will be important and imperative that we acknowledge the team players. Myself being the project lead and Sari being from the sponsor side of SIPS and participating in the quality assurance processes. and Mr. Ozias Nyube and Dr. Ayanda Teta, who provided the lead role as lead researchers. So we want to really thank all. As you see today, is the nature of the presentation is actually quite a little bit different from what you used to, because we are providing you with evidence-based research that we have conducted in the continent. On this note, I would start and become the lead in terms of the presentation, but then our colleagues will come in, Mr. Ozias Nyube, as well as Dr. Ayanda Teta, as she has indicated. In line with the presentation today, our esteemed attendees, we are going to give you a contextual view in terms of the introduction and background, and the problem statement that actually necessitated this particular research project, the aims and objectives which we intended to achieve in the project. We'll give you an overview in terms of the methodological framework that was employed, and then we'll take you through the findings that we had and the kind of suggestions that we want to make going forward in line with post-COVID-19 activities, and how we're going to communicate this research moving from here onwards. And on that context, I just want to highlight that we all know that COVID has had a lot of implications to us, but probably it will be important that as I move along, let me just give a context on where we came from. In terms of the background, you all know and have been engaging with the African Institute for Supply Chain Research, which is aims to drive innovative supply chain and capacity building program to be able to enhance supply chain management and capacity building the content in support of the South African National Development Plan, the Africa Agenda 2063, as well as the Sustainable Developmental Goals. The core mandate, as you see, we want to be able to build capacity, and we said severally that we find that previously supply chain management was being seen as a backroom function. However, we face a lot of challenges, and nowadays, especially with the emergence of COVID-19, many organizations and individuals or professionals are beginning to realize the strategic importance of supply chain management. You would have realized that there are so many supply chain positions that are sitting as vice presidents in different private sector organizations. You would have realized that we have in strategic positions such as the chief procurement officer in many public institutions. You would have realized that we have in many countries that have been able to try and professionalize public procurement. If you look at Zambia, we look at Zimbabwe, Kenya, Mauritius, just to name a few. You also have realized that in many of these public institutions, supply chain management is beginning to see strategic positions where those involved in supply chain tend to report to the ministers in the respective portfolios where supply chain management is seen to be vital. And therefore, to be able to fast track this progress on supply chain management advancement, we engaged together with the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply in 2020, signed in an memorandum of understanding to provide international education and best practices on how we can strengthen relationship to fast track that development so that we can build capacity on supply chain management and support organizations with best practices. And the agreement seeks to also strengthen and diversify, stimulate vibrant evidence-based research. Hence, SIPS and ISCA were able to collaborate on this first project, which looks at COVID-19 sustainable practices in Africa. And the provision of the evidence-based research, we're trusting that it should be able to help professionals, academic, policy decision makers, masters and doctoral students to be able to make meaningful contributions. I mean, one of the key objectives that we have as ISCA is to be able to shape policy decision making so that we can be able to make a contribution to issues of unemployment or socioeconomic development imperative, social justice imperative. So That is the context upon which we came. But you all know very well that, as I indicated, that in fact, COVID-19 have elevated supply chain management. The whole world, including supply chain management, were exposed to critical gaps, disruption, vulnerabilities that were affected by. We look at issues of transport, export, and Africa itself faced a lot of challenges. We have called issues of localizations, industrializations, and for Africa to promote intertrade within Africa. You are aware that most of the bulk of products, goods that we acquire or that we utilize in the continent comes from the West. We've said, how can we support? And in fact, COVID-19 taught us lessons that we could be able to build capacity locally to promote our local content. And some of the key things that we actually face, which spans across the world, as I'm indicating, issues of global sourcing versus local sourcing. COVID-19 also, propelled issues of the fourth industrial revolution. How could we be able to utilize digital strategies, in our supply chain process to maximize efficiency and enhance the performance within the organizations? It also triggered the need for us to beef up legislation loopholes that facilitated unethical practices. Issues of lootings across the continent. I cannot singly call a country, but many African countries fell victims to, vulnerabilities around corruptions. And despite these bedlocks of negativity, which rocks the African continent, despite our numerous resources, there were few organizations that were able to make significant gains with the adverse effect of COVID-19. They remained sustainable and were able to address local concerns in terms of localizations and access to opportunities that presented themselves. And therefore, within the course of this study, we wanted to understand how supply chain executives manage to steer their organizations and navigate the adverse effect of COVID-19 to be able to remain sustainable. And therefore, the key objective that we're trying to look at in terms of our study, as I've articulated in the background, was to determine sustainable supply chain practices that are relevant in the African context post-COVID-19. We had specific objectives that we wanted to address, and we're able to look at issues of the drivers for the adoption and deployment of sustainable supply chain practices and strategies by supply chain practitioners during COVID-19. To identify the sources of vulnerability for supply chains that have been potentially disrupt the supply chain performance, and to identify challenges to supply chain practitioners which influence issues around integrity and the prevailing legislative frameworks. And lastly, we wanted to be able to develop a sustainable supply chain management framework that will help SCM practitioners as well as organizations better prepared for COVID-19, for post-COVID-19. And therefore, these were all the key stuff that we aim to do. And in the course of this presentation, you join us so that we could be able to articulate clearly if those objectives were achieved. And like I indicated earlier on, that this project was actually sponsored by the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, SIPS. And in preparing for this research, we had to ensure that it was rigor in line with the academic imperative. And therefore, we did obtain ethical clearance from the Graduate School of Business Leadership, which is a business school within the University of South Africa, UNISA. And SIPS, we just want to declare clearly that SIPS never had any influential role in terms of the outcome of this research. And in line with the facilitation process that SIPS employed was the approval to conduct research using SIPS membership database. Research is not prejudicial to the reputation of the institute. The research was guided by the fundamentals of ethical considerations, as I indicated that we did have ethical approvals. The research ensured participant confidentiality, and the research and the results and findings not was not misrepresented. The research, as you know, we said ISCA is an independent research institute, and we produce fair and non-biased findings. And therefore, on this note, I want to tell you that confidently, and as an esteemed researcher, which I want to acclaim, that all due processes were being done, and therefore, this research that we'll be presenting to you has the necessary quality assurance and integrity. And therefore, I will now give over to Dr. Ayanda, who will then take us through the next few slides. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Ayanda.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ambe. I'm now going to share with you the methodology that was employed to conduct this particular research. We utilize a descriptive and exploratory research using a mixed method approach, and this entails using both qualitative and quantitative research methodology. So in terms of the stages, stage one was qualitative, and it really entailed a validation of the proposed research instrument that we intended on using for the broader quantitative research. We engaged through interviews with members of the SIPS community, specifically 4 members of the SIPS community that ranged in different areas within Africa. As indicated, this particular research was looking at the impact across Africa. We actively chose to engage with members of SIPS who were fellows, because we were really looking in terms of getting depth of information and knowledge that we could use to validate the instrument that we were going to be utilizing. And we also selected members from a wide range of industries, which included telecommunications, energy, the aluminium, as well as international donor agencies, because once again, we wanted to ensure that we covered quite an extensive, the research instrument and the research that we were going to be utilizing covered quite extensive industries, regions within Africa, as well as individuals. So the interview questions, one, in terms of the qualitative, we're looking to be aligned to the objectives. There was emphasis on various elements. One, we're looking in terms of emphasis on the drivers of sustainable supply chain management practices. We also, there was emphasis in terms of the ethics and integrity and the prevailing legislative frameworks. Just noting that it was across Africa, and there was various legislative frameworks that were impacting the practitioners across the globe. Also looking in terms of the important aspects to develop SCM practices within the framework. One of the objectives of the framework was to come up, of the research was to come up with a framework. And then there were also other issues that we looked in terms of considering in terms of some of the critical enablers and implementation of these proposed sustainable supply chain management practices. So as indicated, that was on the stage one, and the individuals that we were looking at who would then be able to see that our objectives were aligned and the questionnaire was aligned. In the looking in terms of the qualitative, there were some very interesting emerging themes that came out in terms of those interviews. And the participants highlighted themes that included risk management and what needs to happen in terms of risk management, the importance of risk management that exists, and how they themselves utilized various risk management practices to ensure that they were sustainable post-COVID-19. Another theme that came out in these qualitative interviews was the importance of technology as an enabler and also as a driver for these sustainable practices. Another interesting thing that came out was the role of governments. While the different participants sat in different countries, the importance of governments and the role that they play in terms of ensuring that sustainable supply chain management practices are implemented, exist, etc., that came out quite strongly, irrespective of where the particular individuals were sitting in the country, in the continent. Another thing that came out was the importance of agility, agility within supply chain management practices, and how that actually becomes a maker or a breaker of sustainability in the area. Another theme that came out was human capital. And we framed it human capital quite broadly because the participants spoke about the importance of skills development. They also said the importance of competent skills, and it's skills across the board within supply chain management practices, whether it's the skills in terms of digital skills that are needed, specific skills. So we've really spoken about it, made it broad in terms of human capital, as well as the importance of having those resources, that human capital, to be able to implement these particular practices. And then the final emerging theme that came out was actually the intricacies behind humanitarian supply chains, and how, when you look at supply chain management practices, humanitarian supply chains have very unique needs and elements to look at. And this actually came out and was quite also very interesting in terms of our qualitative, to then begin to recognize that even within supply chain management, there are different value chains that have very intricate needs. So in the discussions with the members who were in the humanitarian supply chain space, this theme also came out. I guess also at the same time, because of the time that we were doing the research, obviously COVID, there were a lot of issues that happened, and also humanitarian issues that were affected. So this theme particularly came out. So while we were using this particular stage one of the qualitative to align our objectives, we were very fortunate that the robustness of the interviews allowed various themes to emerge, which we have also documented. And these themes then influenced and made sure that we aligned the quantitative instrument, which now became our stage two of the research. Now, looking at stage two, we then had a quantitative instrument, which was a questionnaire that we sent out. And within that instrument, we divided it into really 9 sections that looked at aspects of drivers, risk management, enablers, etc. So it was broken down into 9 elements. We used the platform of SurveyMonkey to deploy this particular instrument. And through our working with SIPS, the SIPS Africa database was utilized to distribute the questionnaire. So it was distributed throughout the continent, through all the members of SIPS, sitting both on the continent, also perhaps working off the continent, but being influenced in terms of the continent and the supply chain management practices. And we also used the SIPS LinkedIn social media platforms to also distribute the particular questionnaire, so that we could then get an even wider reach in terms of responses to the particular questionnaire. The response in terms of this particular questionnaire, as indicated, the questionnaire was sent to SIPS members. We received 386 responses, And there were really quite comprehensive responses that were provided. And we will talk to those responses later on. And we were fortunate that the respondents were actually quite engaging in terms of the questions and the research. And it wasn't simply just the click, click, click of the research, because we also put certain mitigating measures within the questionnaire to ensure that it wasn't just the click, click, click to get over with. And we were able and really fortunate to see that came out in the richness of the data that we received and the analysis that we conducted on the research. So as indicated, it was mixed method. We had 2 stages, qualitative, and then we had a quantitative instrument that was utilized. And this now will then I will then take you through the beginning of the analysis of the results that we received from those 386 respondents that responded to our questionnaire. So when we look in terms of the analysis, the first thing that we looked at was to ensure that the instrument, and that is the questionnaire that we sent out, was reliability. And we did various tests in terms of reliability. We checked in terms of the different sections of the reliability. And what comes out when you look really at the overall score of the particular, the instrument, you note that there's a 93.8 percentage, and that really does demonstrate in terms of the overall score of the overall score of the instrument indicates that it's really quite reliable. But even when you look at the different sections within the instrument, you can see that really that the instrument is really quite robust. The responses that we received were quite robust, and that reliability check was made in terms of the instrument. We're now looking at terms of the profile that of the respondents. It was distributed when you look in terms of the male and female. We had 39% female respondents and 61% male respondents. And that, when you really look in terms of people within the supply chain space, I'm going to say, unfortunately, because I'm a female in this space, there are more males within that particular space. So this split did not surprise us in terms of the split. But I will always advocate that one day I'll be sitting and it will be 50-50 in terms of the space, but it's something that is expected in terms of supply chain professionals within this space. When you then look at the region in terms of the survey was sent across the continent. And when you look in terms of the responses from the Southern African region, you see that there was a 44% of the participants were from the Southern African region. We had 27% from the East African bloc. And then we had 24% from the West African bloc, 1% from North Africa, and the 4% that indicated other. There may be a surprise in terms of the North Africa bloc where it is 1%, but SIPS Africa, in terms of its members, is predominantly in East, West, and Southern Africa. The Northern bloc sits within SIPS EMEA. So it is not surprising that there's such a small percentage, because the database comes from the Northern African members of SIPS, members of the SIPS, the outside of the SIPS Africa bloc. But there is still, we did get some respondents from that particular North Africa. But what also then comes out in terms of the representation, you can see that there was a good representation from from the East, West, and Southern Africa, which then it also added to the richness of the responses, because we were then also able to delve in a little bit more detail in terms of some of the intricacies that might affect different regions. From there. And then there's just one that they other, and that could be that one, they are sitting outside outside of Africa, though they might have their membership within SIPS Africa. Moving on in terms of just the distribution of the respondents according to their position and experience. We did ask the respondents in terms of their positions within a supply chain, as well as the years that they have been working within the space of supply chain. I'll start with the figure 2, which is in terms of the distribution of the participants according to the position. And what you see there in terms of the position, and in fact, I'd like to then also link it to the years of experience. Most of the participants that responded were from in terms of the supply chain officers, and had between 0 to 5 years experience. So it's a lot of people who are within the entry level within the supply chain space. However, we did get quite a few participants that had extensive experience. When you look, for example, in the 10 to 20 years, as well as the middle between the 11 to 15 years, there's also quite a bit of people with that kind of experience. It is not surprising in terms of the profile of the particular respondents, because also when you look in terms of those who participate within the SIPS area, are those who are entering the market, a lot of them who are also improving their skill set. And those are tend to be those people who would then participate in the research. But having said that, we were fortunate that we did get quite a diverse grouping. We also had, in terms of some supply chain executives that you indicates there, in terms of we did get some supply chain executives responding, as well as a significant number of supply chain managers responding in terms of that. So this really just shows that, yes, there is a diverse range in terms of years, as well as in terms of position. A question that may come up when you look at in terms of the distribution of participants according to position, when you look at the number of 420 for other, the question might be concerning in terms of why was there such a high number of other? And what has come out is that we had indicated some positions. So you'd have people who work within the supply chain space who may not have the designation of, for example, supply chain manager or supply chain officer. They may be perhaps somebody who's working within finance. However, they work within the field of supply chain. And that's the kind of individual who would have responded other, because their designation does not specifically say supply chain manager or something of that. So that is why you have a large number in terms of other. It could be somebody who's also in academic space, who they may be a lecturer, but they may not specifically have the designation that is indicated there. So that is the reason why you have a large, for example, the other, which in the position of 420, that's it, that is other. So it just simply means that they do touch supply chain, they work within the space, but they don't necessarily have the designation that is there. If you can move to the next slide. Mr. Ncube?
On my side, I'm showing the distribution of participants according to education and academic level.
Thank you very much. No, it is just, okay, I guess from my side, there was a bit of a hesitation. In terms of the distribution of participants, we also asked the participants to indicate their level of education, and we also asked them in terms of their professional status. When we looked at the level of education, distribution participants, according to their academic level of education, there you can see in terms of an indication in terms of the distribution that exists. We did have some of those who had a doctoral, which you see sitting at the 12. We had quite a significant number of participants that had master's level, honors, bachelor, etc. This is actually in terms of some of the calls that we make within the profession for skills and education within this space. This is really quite encouraging that those who are participating in this space have quite significant academic qualifications, that exist, which is really quite encouraging. In terms of for us in the professional space. And then also we asked them to do the distribution in terms of the participation according to their profession. And there you then see there's also quite a large spread in terms of the distribution in terms of profession. We did have some participants who had an FSIPS, MSIPS, and then level 5, etc. We use, as we were utilizing SIPS, we use the level indicators as described as per SIPS, and we'd ask the individuals to then tick. Another question in this particular area, where you might say in terms of the other, on this particular aspect, it would be people who may not have in terms of the SIPS level designation. They could be from other industries out there, also from regional industries designations that exist. I give an example of perhaps they could be from SAPIX, which is a different designation, or within the specific region of West Africa, there are some designations that are there, and that is where they would then indicate the designation under other in terms of that particular score. So having said that, what I'm just sharing with you in terms of the level and the range and the richness of the participants that responded. We also then looked at in terms of the industries and the sectors from which our participants came from. You can see from this particular graph that we had a significant 13% coming from the education sector. We also had a significant number looking at the 22.5% coming from the public sector within their various industries. We also had quite a few, and 93% coming from the manufacturing, but there really was a range in terms of where these practitioners are, industries that they fall in, which also added to the richness of the variation and the richness of the data that was provided. And then the other would be other industries that would not specifically be indicated, where they would then say that it's from another industry. But you can really see that we went from the range from education to mining to manufacturing to ICT to the financial services sector, as well as the public sector, both specific government as well as state-owned entities in the various countries that we looked at. And that then just adds to the broadness of the data and from the respondents that we received from this particular survey. Thank you very much, Mr. Ncube. I'm now going to hand over to Mr. Ncube, who will then take you through the various objectives and continue on the analysis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nteta. Can I get a confirmation that I'm audible enough?
Yes, you are.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Now we'll zoom in specifically onto the objectives. As Prof. Ambe indicated the objectives at the beginning of the presentation, I will try and sort of guide this presentation in alignment with those objectives. The first one was to try and identify what could be the drivers that could be compelling us as practitioners and our organizations to adopt sustainable supply chain management practices, and then move through the rest of the objectives. In our analysis, which was quite comprehensive, given the diversity of the respondents, both from a geographical perspective, but also from an experience perspective, and also from an industry sector perspective, quite a few things emerged. I've tried to characterize them in bold on the left-hand side from a grouping perspective, that the first really pressure or driver for adoption comes in from the market itself. And on the market side, we know that sustainability has become a dominant theme in the past 10 years, mostly from a social responsibility perspective, but also from a concern from an environmental perspective. But besides that, we also observed that the kind of militancy that has come through from both the client/customer side, but also the stakeholder community that is observing supply chain practices, there seems to be pressure there that supply chains do appear to be sustainable, do appear to have adopted sustainable practices. During the COVID period, what really emerged was the issues around volatility in demand patterns and a sense of distortions really around the market characteristics. And it does appear that those organizations that appeared to have a semblance of closeness to society, either through their own local sourcing strategies, seemed to perform better. And we will see the bigger part of those pressures towards the end when we look at the framework. The second pressure that emerged, or the second driver that emerged, was really digitalization. And this is critical for those that sort of existed in a digitally disrupted environment during the COVID period through remote working, for instance. Most of their capability to function was really affected. If there were issues around the desire to collaborate and share information either on the upstream side with the supply side or on the downstream side with the customer side, if you're not connected, if you're not integrated, it created a lot of challenges from a performance point of view. And we looked at some of the concerns that were emerging from both the interview session and also the instrument itself. Dr. Nteta has magnified the issue around agility. How responsive were supply chains to changing demands in the marketplace? In terms of visibility, especially with respect to requirements, the capabilities from the supply side, the demands from the customer side, without digitalization, without integration, those visibilities were not possible. And then lastly, because of the pressure from the stakeholder community, the issue of traceability emerged also as being very, very pronounced. Dr. Nteta did allude to the fact that during the conversations in the interviews, there was lamenting from the senior fellows on what they've observed themselves within their own organizations, but also within the profession itself, that the issue of risk and business continuity appeared not to be taken very seriously and diligently. While there's a lot of efforts concentrating around risk management and risk management practices, but the extension to cover the business continuity aspect seemed to be lacking. And that was seen with quite a lot of collapse by significant value chain players. And the things that emerged from a continued business continuity point of view was really a sense that there was lack of impact analysis, a lack of understanding of what are the business continuity best practices that exist and how these then could be accommodated and harmonized with normal supply chain practices. The last issue that really sort of put pressure for the adoption, first and foremost, was the imposition through legislation in all our different countries and legislative frameworks environment. And then for the professionals themselves, they need to be seen and provide evidence through audit processes that you are actually compliant to those legislative frameworks. And over and above, obviously, overall concern around supply chain practitioners, around issues of ethics, around issues of integrity, and these inherently linked directly to a perception of corruption within the practitioner space. And for those of us who belong to professional bodies, we know that professional bodies, they themselves have got standards also and code of conduct, and through that voluntary self-policing, through those kind of standards, they then act as an agitator for the adoption of sustainable supply chain practices. So I could say that in a nutshell, these are the four groups that emerged as drivers, and individually, we could look at the minor indicators or motivations or pressures for adoption. The second objective focused on the perception of vulnerability. And we can't talk about vulnerability without linking directly to the events that will make us realize those vulnerabilities. So in our minds, when we set up the instrument, we already linked vulnerability and disruption. So in the presentation, I will try and cover both the vulnerability aspect and also the events or the incidents that will cause a disruption in the supply chain for us to realize this vulnerability and experience a negative impact. I am aware that some of the slides will appear to be very, very busy, but I try to be as informative as possible in terms of what we are sharing. I've provided here a table with a lot of detail. Probably the first detail that I would like to draw your attention to is really the number of observations. You notice that when we're presenting the profile of respondents, we had 386 respondents. But when Dr. was presenting the profile of those respondents, we did notice a significant number from the emerging supply chain practitioner space. And when you look at some of the items that I'll be presenting, there will be lack of consistency with that 386, with the numbers dwindling a little bit. And that really reflects that some of our respondents might have found some of our questions either of a strategic nature or of a complex nature that they were uncomfortable to air a view, but still we did receive significant number of responses to allow us to carry out the analysis. What I've highlighted in red is what emerged as the really dominant vulnerabilities. The biggest one was really fluctuation of prices in the supply market space, people taking advantages of artificial shortages and astronomically increasing supply prices. The second one was really the issues around availability. So again, capacity fluctuations, creating artificial shortages or shortages being experienced in the supply market emerged as the second vulnerability. Then the third vulnerability was really logistics oriented, more from a perception of poor performance from a delivery perspective, again from the supply side. I did bring in a few towards the bottom of your screen there that tried to focus on the internal perspectives, especially from a technical or ICT systems perspective. The mean average is fairly low, but is very, very close to 3, creating an impression that yes, even though they didn't seem to be quite a concern, but that moderate worry is significant. I deliberately added the issue of standard deviation to bring in a diversity element. When you look at standard deviations, at the moment, acceptable norms, if there's sort of a consensus, we will expect them to be really around 0.5 at the highest, preferably even less than that. But these standard deviations are greater than 0.5, creating a perception of a wide range of opinions, where potentially those pockets of excellence that we spoke about at the beginning of the presentation may not have experienced these kind of vulnerabilities. And the majority did experience these kind of vulnerabilities, hence pulling the mean a little bit closer to the consent side. But that diversity really does indicate a wide range in terms of either experiences or perceptions around vulnerability. If we wanted to look at them from a comparability point of view, we thought the stacked bar graphs could give an appropriate mental picture. We'll just focus on 3 boxes: your gray box, which sort of represents average exposure, your yellow box, which represents high exposure, and your light blue, which represents extreme exposure. So if I take for the first one, really around the volatility of demand, if I take those 3, that length is quite significant, 80%, which really indicates a lot of concern, a sense that we were highly exposed as supply chains. If I look at the next one, when you look at it, it's quite long, almost indicating 90% of concern, and that deals directly with price fluctuations. Hence, we were indicating that price fluctuation became a significant concern from a vulnerability point of view. But by and large, all of the vulnerabilities identified, you can see that they are really more or less above the 50% mark, in a sense confirming that as supply chains, we were vulnerable during the COVID period. When it came to disruptions, we initially, using literature, we pre-identified what is emerging both in our corridors from an international point of view in the practitioner space, but also what has emerged in the early literal works around assessing the disruptions on supply chain. We created a pre-qualified list of the type of disruptions that could have been experienced, and then requested our respondents to give us their perceptions around those pre-identified disruptions. We are calling them potential disruptions. At the top, I've tried to provide a scale so that it makes it easier for yourselves to interpret. The top part is about likelihood. The bottom part is about impact. When we look at it from a likelihood perspective, I've bolded the ones that have come out as being very significant, worth discussing during the presentation, but the others will also be providing a significant report through SIPS platforms later on. The biggest concern does seem to have been concerns around transportation. The second one around the health of both supply chain practitioners and general health of workers in the supply space, in the focal organization, and on the customer side. When looking at transportation, over and above disruption from a schedule point of view, we also zoomed in on accidents themselves. And again, they turned out also to be quite dominant from a concern point of view, with a significant impact there around medium to moderate. And environmental disasters here, mostly we're both looking at the physical environment, also the social environment where we operate, with a lot of businesses that are interlinked with our supply chains, almost grounding to a halt, therefore creating a social dimension or a social disaster in the environment that our supply chains exist. If we also do the same thing and look at it from a stacked bar graph perspective and try and do a comparative analysis again, looking at the length of the significant indicators, I will take the green. I think this is purple. Hopefully I'm right in colors. My glasses don't seem to be very good. And then the light blue, meaning that I'm taking the top three. If you look at the top three, again, you can see that from a length point of view, it is minimum at least 50% concern. This is fairly long, which speaks about those transport disruptions that I indicated. This is fairly long, which speaks about those health hazards or health concerns for staff that I've indicated. This is also fairly, probably not so long, but still greater than 50%. You've got your transport, again, also being greater than 50% from a likelihood of occurrence point of view. From an impact perspective, yes, transport disruptions were quite significant in terms of impact, followed by the health concerns, again, in terms of impact. And to a greater extent, all others had more than 50%, were causing more than 50% worry for what is emerging from the respondents. So these were potential disruptions. We thought, okay, let us be very specific and look at the ones that were actually experienced. We did not have a comprehensive list, but we thought that this list will suffice to give us an initial indication of the disrupting events for supply chain. Lo and behold, finance emerged as the biggest disruptor, meaning that from a supplier's perspective, the ability to pay within reasonable time to allow for cash access or reducing of the payment cycles became quite critical for Survivor. And from a frequency point of view, it was really the dominant disruptor. For clients, they looked at supplier performance as the one having the second significant impact. Most suppliers were affected. Their ability to deliver on time, to deliver quality was affected. And it emerged again as the second highest in terms of frequency. We had the concerns around clients, either in terms of amplification of demands because of perceptions of potential shortages emerging. That became this third significant disruptor for suppliers, as they had to ramp up productions at times, they themselves having scarcity of resources, both from a raw material point of view, but also from a labor force point of view, to be able to meet those amplified commitments. But by and large, all the identified disruptors were really of medium to high concern, which is quite significant, and it does really create an understanding and awareness that we're really disrupted as a supply chain fraternity. Doing the same from a comparative analysis point of view, looking at the top 3 bars and looking at them in terms of their length, all of them, you could see that they are more than 60% from a concern point of view, really showing that there was significant impact that warranted concerns from a supply chain performance point of view. Then, what are these supply chain management practices that we are alluding to? We delved into literature to try and get a sense of how these sustainable practices are being characterized. And you'll see that the top 5 are what is generally accepted and regarded and traded amongst ourselves as professionals, as practitioners in the space. The first one is really an environmental focus. What is the impact of our operations, supply chain activities on the environment? The second one is really the social oriented. What is the impact of our supply chain management activities or our presence within society? The third one is an inward look in terms of our operations. What are the issues that we're doing internally as organizations to be seen to be transitioning towards sustainability? And then the next 2 are really more around competitiveness in the marketplace. The first one looking at the degrees of integration so that we can be able to have those traceability, those visibility elements that we're looking for from a driver's point of view. The second one really being the economic aspects, or we could call them economic or competitive aspects. From those that are in the commercial side of things, is really your profitability. From those of you that are in the public service space, it's really the efficiencies that you can accrue utilizing your budgeted amounts. Over and above these understood or well-known practices, we added those that emerged from our qualitative stage 1 interaction with the fellows. The first one was really the issue of technology and digitalization. The second one was the risk management practices that will then give us a perspective around business continuity. And Dr. Nteta was at pains to talk about the human capital aspects and the experiences of practitioners during the COVID period, whether they've been empowered enough to deal with the disrupted environment. You will notice then that from a dominant perspective, the bottom three really emerged as the biggest concern from a practice point of view. And I've highlighted there in red the risk management aspect, showing 95% of the respondents really indicating this to be important to extremely important, with an average of 4.8, which is the highest average in terms of all our indicators, in terms of all our subsections, that risk management practices, they were seen to be extremely important. At the moment, we're not so sure. I'll be showing that in the next slides, whether this importance is influenced by the fact that they were being practiced, or is being influenced by the fact that they were absent, and as supply chains we were underprepared and therefore negatively affected. So that is the first dominant practice. The second one looked at ourselves as practitioners. Were we adequately equipped to deal with the disrupted environment? And the resounding answer is that yes, 92% of us show that the combo of skills and competencies that we have is extremely important towards the implementation of sustainable supply chain management practices. We will see how this then ties in with the broader conversation around continuous development and around professionalization. But what I would like to bring to your attention is that all the supply chain management practices that have been identified as sustainable practices all showed a mean of above 4, indicating that as far as supply chain performance is concerned, these practices are extremely critical. If you want to look at them again, juxtaposed next to each other, as Teta indicated earlier on, because we wanted this not to be a tick box, we reversed the order of importance, and in this particular instance, indicated that 1 should reflect extremely important, and 5 should reflect not important. It was quite clear that the respondents really took their time, applied their mind, and read the instructions very well, and read the questions very well, and responded accordingly. Otherwise, there's no way that we can get a sense of this head perspective when people are just taking chances. And from our side as researchers, we really want to applaud and thank the respondents for taking this exercise as seriously as they did. And what are we seeing emerging from these results? Like I indicated in the previous slide, that there was really consensus, almost above 90%, that all the identified practices were extremely important, extremely critical from a sustainability point of view. The next question was that we cannot just pay lip services to these practices. We need to be able to reflect on how we can track our performance once deployed, once implemented. Probably can say fortunate or unfortunate. Again, we to resort back to literature and look at what are the dominant metrics that are emerging from that space, and use them to try and see whether are we utilizing them to track sustainable supply chain performance. By and large, all the metrics that were identified were endorsed by the respondents. I've tried to highlight the dominant ones as really being a concern around delivery performance, the on-time delivery part, and then a tie around response time and supply chain cost. And response time here really is an issue of reaction. If circumstances change because of the circumstances that we're in during COVID, how responsive were we as supply chains? And that was a significant indicator of performance that was identified by our respondents. In terms of the juxtaposition again, you can also see now the length of the, if I could say, the top 3 bars. That really does emphasize that all of them, if I'm ending at green, all of them, you can see that they were deemed to be very important indicators of tracking performance. I would like to draw your attention to the social impact matrices. In here, obviously, we should have probably tried to decouple that statement and come up with specific indicators around localization, around industrialization. But by and large, the respondents did confirm that those are required, and those are very, very important, because we need to be able to report back on the impact of our supply chain activities from a social dimension or from a social perspective. The next objective was really to focus on ourselves as practitioners and get a sense of what we felt was dilapidating in terms of capacitating us to be able to function effectively and efficiently, in order to be able to drive our supply chain activities towards efficiency, towards effectiveness. And key to the theme was the impact really of the new promulgated statutory requirements within probably still fixed legislative frameworks. The focus on ourselves from a perception of integrity, from a perception of ethics and ethical conduct. We asked a lot of questions. Those questions, some of them were looking at us as individuals, but some were looking at our operating environment from an enablement point of view. And what emerged from the responses, I've tried to summarize it again in terms of these stacked bar graphs. And I'd like to draw your attention to the top 3 bars, because those then indicate a sense of what the organizations or ourselves faced from a challenge point of view, or from a focus point of view, or from a prioritization point of view. If you look at the top three graphs, you can see that by and large, all of them in a way indicate an above 60% focus on all the pre-identified issues from a challenge point of view, or from a prioritization point of view, or from an impact on practice perspective. I've tried to summarize them again in the next presentation. Looks like I've taken out the table. So if we just look at the lens, then it's clear that the ethics component is one of the longest around ethics and integrity concerns. The next one is really the issues around compliance with the new promulgated emergency measures in some countries, or the new enabling statutory requirements from our own internal organizations in terms of creating a sense of agility. I can also draw your attention to the human capital development, or the skills necessary to navigate the changing environment. So these are the ones that I'm terming questions that focused on ourselves as individuals, focused on ourselves as practitioners. Then the next of the questions really looked at it from an enabling environment point of view. And you can see that digitalization there is also emerging as really a concern from an enabling environment point of view. We can also look at statutory requirements there emerging again as a concern from an enabling environment point of view, and then some coming from the market from a pressure point of view, and being really our ability to fulfill orders, our ability to respond through time compression, and then the technology parts. And you can see IT also there emerging as being very significant. The next question was really trying to look at the issue of concern from a business continuity point of view, from a risk management point of view. We asked a series of questions, and these questions were really demarcated or segregated into 3 key focal areas. The first part was really a sense that is there an appropriate and acceptable and satisfactory risk management approach in the organization. The second segmentation looked at how we utilize it. Is it really being utilized appropriately for monitoring and control? And then the third or last part was really the governance around making sure that audits are done and there's a sense of response or implementation of mitigation strategies in the event of disturbances, as we indicated with those vulnerabilities concerned. If you look at this question again, here we reversed the order, and one was one that was desirable, where there's a strong agreement, and 5 was one that where there is there was less agreement with the statement, and the statement were really being placed in a manner that is positive to the organization. And in some way, you do get a sense from the respondents that there is a sense of agreement, to strongly agree. If I just look at the bottom 2, if I just look at the bottom 2, that we do have some kind of risk measures in place. But my concern and our concern as researchers was looking at the top 3 bars, which really reflected neutrality, disagreement, and strongly disagree. I mean, these bars are fairly significant. The first one indicates neutrality, disagreement are of 35% of the respondents. This one, almost 45%. They are fairly long and fairly reflective of a huge concern that is emerging from ourselves, that potentially risk management is not at the level where we expect it to be, and therefore it affects the ability of our supply chains, of our own organizations, to think around the issues of business continuity and adopt appropriate business continuity and harmonize them with our risk management plans to ensure consistency of supply chain performance. They may appear to be small, but their mere existence for us as practitioners, for us as captains of industry, is really of concern. They should really be negligible. Based on that detailed discussions, we then took a step back and said, what are we seeing from these results? What is being revealed to us? How can we try and communicate some kind of framework that yourselves as practitioners, our organizations, the industry in general, could start thinking around as a potential guiding framework for implementing these supply chain management practices? And the next slide is a little bit busy, but we hope that it will then really provide a little bit of clarity on how we can start orienting our supply chains towards the adoption of these sustainable supply chain management practices and deployment for to ensure performance post-COVID, or in the event that we're faced with another turbulence that disrupts the supply chain. How should we navigate it? My apologies for some of the wording that may be a little bit small. As indicated, the presentation will be made available to you, both as PowerPoints, but also as a recording. Hopefully later on spare time, you can get a little bit of clarity in terms of these technologies that appear to be very minute, but I'll try and take you through all of them. From the onset, as supply chain, we're always concerned about supply chain performance. That's why you see performance being highlighted there and being really boldened so that it provides us with focus. The triangle itself is the area that represents sustainable practices. And we've named those sustainable practices, sustainable operations, sustainable social practices, the issues around economic practices or / competitiveness practices, the issue around concern for the environment, or you could say green supply chain practices. We spoke about the integration part of supply chain to maximize those concerns around visibility, around collaboration, so that there can be sharing of information. There can be opportunities for heightened response or heightened agility. And then we brought in the disruption from the technology and the adoption of digitalization throughout the operating environment. So these are the practices that we're terming sustainable supply chain practices, and their deployment, their implementation will affect supply chain performance. From what the respondents have shared with us, we highlighted the following as the kind of enablers for the implementation of those sustainable supply chain management practices. I think the first enabler was really technology, and it came through consistently, both in our qualitative study, but also within the analysis itself. The second enabler was really the issues around ethics, integrity, and governance. Once the legislative environment was sort of disrupted by new promulgations, and practitioners tried to be quite agile in responding, there have been a lot of cases where they've seen to have acted unethical. Some of them, we have quite a lot of cases that are sub judice now that are in the court, mostly because of the perceptions around non-compliance, the perceptions around unethical practice, the perception around integrity of the practitioners being really brought to question. The second one, or the third one, really looked at what we've termed internal capabilities. Essentially, what is it that we had as operating environments, as organizations, from a supply chain point of view, that was seen to be enhancing efficiency, that was seen to be enhancing effectiveness. We are calling those internal capabilities. In there, you are looking at your transition towards utilizing energy efficient operations, or transition towards renewable energies, as an example, to power your operating environment, your concerns around the safety and health of your own workspace, the type of equipment that you are utilizing, and this footprint from a carbon point of view, your focus on quality, your abilities to track the market dynamics, the market behaviors, and position your resources appropriately for you to be responsive as an organization. So we're calling all those internal capabilities. Then the third enabling part is an understanding of the space that you service as a supply chain, your client-centeredness or your customer focus, especially given the militancy that we're beginning to see from some of our clients and also from some of our stakeholders towards this issue of sustainability. So having a consistent focus and understanding their own drivers as clients and what they mean for ourselves as servicers of those requirements. I've already indicated that Toda spoke about human capital from two angles. The first one really being the availability of that competent capital, and the second one being the consistent desire to upskill and remain relevant in a changing, disrupted environment. The next enabler really was risk management, and that consistently emerged both from the qualitative side and also from the quantitative side. From these enablement, it is clear then that if appropriate business continuity lenses are utilized to support the implementation of sustainable practices, that implementation has a bedrock that it can stand upon, and through the enabling factors, through a consistent introspection around the ability to identify challenges, prepare for their reaction, and consistently ensure that as supply chains, as organizations will remain active, will remain sustainable, and you can consistently perform. At the bottom, like any organization, we still require an efficient or an enabling operating environment. That's why we're putting that foundation or that bedrock for the framework. We do recognize that in our different settings, obviously, we've always positioned supply chain to support business strategy. That's why we're indicating that that arm of the triangle really is about the strategy and how we as supply chain align to that business strategy. We have also recognized that we exist in a legislated environment, and we need to understand the legislations that impact us on the supply chain side, and make sure that we position ourselves to comply with those legislation. And then that will tie in nicely with the compliance issue from a governance point of view, from this enabling part. And obviously the bottom part being this consistent focus on being wary about vulnerabilities and being able to put measures in place that make us adaptable, that make us be able to react and respond and still remain functional and being able to service our clients and customers, which we're calling business continuity. So from ourselves as researchers, this is the framework that we are deriving from the information that we've received from both the high-level interviews with the fellows and also the responses that we've received from those that responded through the questionnaire. What does then this mean from an implementation point of view or from an adoption point of view? We thought that probably it's best to segregate this into three focal areas. Obviously, today we're together as practitioners, as professionals, so we are the first to be affected by the framework. And what is emerging clearly is that we need to do an introspection on our skills profile. We need to do an audit on our skill set, and then continue with the capacitation conversations that we've been having all along. And that can be through formal academic programs that are supply chain oriented, or that can be through training service providers that we have within our midst, being able to provide us with programs that continuously upskill us, either through workshops, like workshops of this nature, or formalized training. I think we need to really think seriously about what does ethics integrity mean for us in the profession. And at an individual level, what are those values that will make sure that consistently, when we do execute our supply chain responsibilities, we are ethical, our decision-making, our values are anchored on integrity, and we are guided by the operating policies that we have within our organizations so that we can ensure compliance. I do understand that at times there is a perception of conflict between being seen to be compliant to directives that may necessarily not be proper and order from a professional standing point of view. But as practitioners, we need to continue having these conversations. And as you see towards the end, I will then rely on the professional setup to really help us by providing us with guidelines that will ensure that we are not found wanting from an ethics and integrity perspective. If we then come back to the organizations themselves, I think it's clear that we as supply chains, practitioners will require an enabling environment. And it is clear at the moment that there can never be an enabling environment if it's not digitalized. So the biggest takeaway from this exercise is the motivation, a huge call from us practitioners to our environments to say, please digitalize, because if we digitalize, we are able then to have consistency of connection, both with our downstream supply side and our upstream consuming side, such that in the event that we are called in to be responsive, to be agile, or to provide reports on how far we've gone towards sustainability through traceability, through visibility, through agility, we are able to do that. So the idea of supply chain integration does not become a pipe dream. It's really lived, it becomes a lived experience. The second part, which was really damning, especially from the fellows, was really the issue around business continuity. Elevating our risk focus more towards a strategic perspective that is anchored on a desire to be continuous, to be a continuous performing from a business concern point of view. Then the last part is really to the professional space. I know that in South Africa, we are busy now setting up the Supply Chain Council of South Africa. And I know that we do have the Kenya Institute of Supply Management. I am aware that we've got supply chain organizations in both Zimbabwe, in Zambia, in Malawi, in Ghana. We need to continue with that professionalization conversation. And we hope that as we coalesce towards a common goal, a common organization that is fed through by our individualized organizations, we are able to have a set of homogeneous codes of conduct, which hopefully in the not too distant future will lead to some sort of license to practice within our supply chain space. And therefore, through our skills development, we could set ourselves up to acquire, if we've not yet acquired, those licenses to practice. But given the profile of our responses from what Dr. Nteta presented, I know that from a SIPS membership point of view, quite a few of the respondents, or probably let me say the majority of the respondents, are either licensed already through their designations. And I'm hoping that some of you in the audience, through your own professional setup, you are licensed. But if you're not licensed, we need to be really motivating for the adoption of these standards and these codes of conduct, and then championing the license to practice. I think from our side, this is what we are recommending as we think about consistently implementing this sustainable supply chain framework that we've developed. We hope it's going to resonate with yourselves as individuals, but also with the organizations that you come from. And lastly, tie in nicely with conversations that are being championed by our professional bodies. What next from today? Obviously, from a research point of view, we want to reach as wide an audience as possible. So the first communication to the supply chain practitioner space is this webinar that we've organized today. The next communication is the concluding of this report and formal presentation to SIPS to include as part of the knowledge base that is shared or is available to their membership. Obviously, myself as the lead researcher with the team, I made commitments to my business school that when the research is done and concluded, we're not going to hide the outcome of the research. It will be shared accordingly in platforms that the business schools regard as reputable. So here I'm looking at supply chain research general platforms. I'm also looking at collaborative business platforms that talk about supply chain issues. So that will be the third stage in terms of communicating these results. And then what we perceive as the last activities really, especially organized events. I am based in Johannesburg and we do have a SIPS branch in around the area of the business school, which we expect to be able to also engage thoroughly with them in terms of the outcome of this research. And we're hoping that the other professional settings within their own realm will be able to get in touch with us and afford us an opportunity to share with them in a more structured conversational way to unpack in greater detail, since we were able to actually get responses from throughout the continent. The further conversations can actually be tailor-made, either to focus on an industry sector or to focus on the elements that are really geographically specific. I think with these words, Prof. Ambe and Dr. Nteta, I hand over to you to take over the comments and questions section. Thank you. Dr. Nteta.
Thank you very much. That was, yes, I think I will come here now to we just swap in the roles, because Dr. Nteta will also be part of the responses that are coming in. I want to especially thank our attendees that are here that have sacrificed to stay with us. You would agree with me, as I indicated earlier on, that this was intensive research, and we really wanted to give it out to the SCM community. And just like you have indicated in the last slide, that we'll use the necessary avenues and platforms to be able to disseminate this particular research throughout the continent. Colleagues, thank you very much once more, Tate Ozi and Dr. Ayanda, for the brilliant work. And we also thank our partner, SIPS, that Sari is not able to be here due to reasons beyond her control. But we'll now take the opportunity to engage in the presentation, and I'll call on our fellow participants. You could be able to raise your hands, and so that I can be able to, if there are issues that you want to interrogate, get clarity on in respect to the report that we've just presented. It's open. I'll call on Vinolia just to bring to my attention if there are any individuals that wants to comment or ask questions. But before I'll come to you, let me just look on the chat platforms. I see a lot of congratulatory and appreciative messages that are coming in terms of the quality of the research that was conducted and the manner of presentation. But I see there's one question here from Tombozulu, Cynthia, who says that social and green aspects were identified as drivers. Financial aspect was not identified as a driver. Why? Tate Ozi?
Sorry, Prof. I'm actually talking to myself. Can you confirm that the slide of the drivers is visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Thank you so much for that question. And you are right in a way that we, based on the presentation of the drivers, even though we did allude to the fact that finance, let me see, even though we did allude to the fact that finance was really considered as a huge concern, as a disruptor, when we're thinking about sustainability, we are not magnifying its role. I think I will take it that I'll definitely need to give it prominence. But however, our thinking when we spoke about the pressure that is coming through from the market itself, both from the client side and also from the stakeholder perspective, and the militants that is coming through there, we know that if there's no transition, it does really impact on financial performance. Yeah, I think Prof, our thinking at that time was that we needed to magnify the pressure points, but I do see from the question and from how the question is positioned is that what is the impact of non-transition? The impact of non-transition will impact on financial sustainability. So potentially in our formal report, I'll also then magnify financial, but from our side, it was because it is a consequence. There is something that is driving, and finance becomes a consequence of non-adherence. I don't know whether that answers the question.
Thanks. Cynthia, if you wouldn't mind, could you just unmute yourself and probably substantiate, and if the response is sufficient, you could just indicate. Thank you. Over to you, Cynthia.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Prof. I think the response is sufficient, and I'm happy in terms of what Mr. Ncube have just said. Yeah. But I raise that because my understanding is that in sustainability, you will always have all the three elements when you talk about sustainability. So hence I raised that question because I could say that there are only two aspects that I mentioned under market pressure. But as he was presenting further, he indicated that finance was, it's a huge disruptor, which that also then responded to the concern or the question that I had. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. We do appreciate. I think that is clear because it's there. So probably it will need to be able to look at that aspect as a driver because the financial aspect is clearly covered in the report. We get appreciation also from Prof. Celias in terms of the extent of the work. Colleagues, is there anybody that would want to make a comment or questions? Please, you could just indicate and come on. Let's get your views in terms of the quality of the work that has been done, so we could be able to make an improvement on the final.
Prof, I can't see comments from my side, so I'm also going to rely on you if there are specific questions on the comment side.
Yes, I think for me, you see, colleagues have indicated that there was thoroughness in terms of this report, and we've got a lot of appreciation. So I think on that note, we'll take to give a breather in terms of the time that we have taken in this report. We've seen comments about requesting for the slides as indicated on the chat platform. It will be provided to you, and the recordings are also available on ISCA, a social media platform which you could be able to access. And we've already given an indication of the way forward of this particular work, and therefore you would be able to see it in different areas because we want to be able to ensure that the results, are disseminated to the various supply chain management platforms. And also, we are calling on everyone here to join us in this journey, and that if you could be able to make contributions in terms of a research project, kindly just indicate to the ISCA Secretariat, and they would let us know. And if you also feel that there are organizations that we could be able to approach, or there are specific problems or challenges that you would want us to be able to investigate, to be able to determine the key, the status of things with respect to the research, we are very, very open. I think it is also important as we conclude, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, our attendees, is that the Institute is open. We're looking for collaboration. We want to work with organizations, both in the public as well as private sector. We're looking to make a contribution to a socioeconomic development imperative and inclusive growth from supply chain management perspective. We are looking forward to driving supply chain capacity development, advancement, skills, advisory services. We are looking forward to supporting transparency, accountability, good governance through supply chain management practices. we are looking to live up to the expectations of the African development, Agenda 23 expectations, trade, regional integration, infrastructural development. You know where that there are a lot of focus in terms of multilateral organizations supporting development in Africa. We're also looking to support, the supply chain management challenges and providing support from health and humanitarian issues. And also we'll continue with our outreach and networking activities. So the Institute, it is a nonprofit and it is open to all of us. If you feel there are unique contributions that you want to make, as indicated, please contact the Secretariat. On this note, I want to thank you all for affording the time to be here to listen to us. It took quite a while, given the comprehensiveness of the research. I want to be able to appreciate and thank our fellow presenters, Mr. Nube Uzias, as well as Dr. Yandan Teta, and thanking SIPS and SAR in particular in absentia for the support and making sure that this work goes through. I think on that note, colleagues, I want to thank you all and please do have a blessed day ahead. And I wish you well in your other endeavors. Thank you. We've come now to the end and therefore we adjourn the session.